So welcome Dr. Angela Smith for coming. We're doing a video series here at the American College of Sports Medicine annual meeting in New Orleans with leaders in sports medicine and exercise science. And when I put the list together, you were way high up on my list. So I'm glad you had time to do this. So thanks so much. So anyhow, the way we wanted to start was sort of tell us where you're at now, what you're doing, your practice, and those sorts of things.
I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon. I'm currently a non-operative surgeon in Philadelphia at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So by being a non-operative surgeon, as sad as it is to leave the operative part behind, it frees me up to do things with organizations such as ACSM, but it also allows me to spend more time with the patients that I do see. So I tend to see patients with multi-joint problems, people with more difficult problems that other people have not quite possibly just had the time to listen to the complexity of the story, because as you probably know, most of the time the patients tell you the answer if you just listen long enough. They tell you what's wrong with them. But in our state, the malpractice insurance is extremely high if you are an operative surgeon, and so you are constrained by the number of new patients you must see to sustain that operative practice.
I see.
So it's not just the additional hours you're spending in the operating room that increase the time. It's that you have to see many patients, some not many of whom, in fact, you wouldn't be able to spend as much time with as you would like. So this allows me to see patients the way that I want to see them. And also to be able to do the volunteer kinds of things that I want to do. The most exciting thing is actually where I'm moving next.
I didn't know about
which
that.
Is, this is hot off the press, although I'll be talking about it tonight in my citation award speech. Last year, you may recall that Jim Salas said as he accepted his citation award, and I sincerely hope that someday there's a landscape architect standing up here accepting this award, because that's where we're going to really make a big difference.
Yeah, I do remember.
Well, I was sitting way in the back of the room last year, and I'd, for about 3 years, been daydreaming about maybe as a next career I could go be a landscape architect, because my grandfather was an architect. All my family have been interested in landscape design, and I've been loving having the stewardship of this land that we currently have at our house and totally developing it from clay parking lots, basically, to beautiful gardens. So I've been thinking, well, I want to design some sort of fitness garden for baby boomers. But how am I going to go about doing that? Well, I probably should know something, and besides, I would love to just know this for knowledge. And so I'd been kind of looking at these programs and thinking, oh, this is pie in the sky, we shouldn't do that. So then Jim Salas comes and says this. I went, okay, fine. So we're going to go talk to the landscape design program at Penn and see just if there's some way we can collaborate, or what kind of knowledge does the dean think that somebody who has no clue about landscape architecture needs to be able to do it. I've got the fitness knowledge, but not the other.
How can we pull this off?
Yeah, how does this work? And
that is exciting.
You know, when I saw the tuition, I choked and decided the tuition and the time component, neither of them would reasonably work. It just made no sense. But he said, but you don't need to be a landscape architect to do what we're talking about. I said, oh. And he said, no, in fact, it makes absolutely no sense for you to become a landscape architect. And what has come out of that is that probably starting with the fall semester, certainly no later than spring semester, but looks like it's going to be fall semester, because they're just now setting that up in early June, that I will be adjunct faculty in their department for what will be a multi-school design studio. The students spend 4 hours Mondays and Thursdays designing a neighborhood fitness park for Philadelphia. We'll have input from someone from the business school, someone from the law school, giving us the code problems. We'll have worked with the public health school, and almost all of whom are ACSM members who I've been meeting with here. And so we're really looking at this going forward. Until yesterday, I was at the Built Environment Symposium, where all these things take 10 years to do, 20 years to do. Well, we've never quite accomplished this one. So then I got really scared, so I realized I don't speak landscape architecture language. They don't speak mine. They don't understand the public health people. But I think it's going to work, because We're just going to make it work.
Do you have a place in Philadelphia where you can use as sort of a model or a test spot?
Well, this
or
will be
whatever?
the model. In fact, what's
So-
so cool about this is that the landscape architects and the public health people have tried to get together with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation assistants and other people's assistants. Jim Salas was actually invited to speak at the Landscape Architecture Organization. And there has been such a schism that the landscape architects feel talks down to. The public health people say they don't want us. It's apparently that somehow it hasn't been possible to get it together. So we want to try to make this work. In Philadelphia, the malpractice situation may be terrible, but we have some really great resources, and one of them is something called the Philadelphia Flower Show that people come from all over the world and pump thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars into Philadelphia for this show. All of those funds go into projects funded by something called Philadelphia Green, which currently funds development of community gardens and vegetable gardens and these kinds of things. We also have an abundance of abandoned lots that the city loves to have cleaned up. So we're going to try to put together what the public health groups say is the best place where we have good community involvement, where we can get all the people to make this be sustainable.
Sure.
We're going to then travel around through those possible sites and choose one for where we think not only do we have the best community, but the best site for the students to get excited about, because the second objective of this is to help conquer urban blight. And then my part is to help the students understand what are the kinds of components that someone needs to become physically fit. How might one use the things that they come up with, and what are some ideas that they might want to design into things, and then also to bring in the public health people for an outcomes measurement. So I've now suddenly become very applied.
Right.
So I've gone from medicine. Usually we have basic and applied science. Now I got medicine and applied science.
Right.
I think I'm really looking forward to it. So that's my
nice.
latest endeavor.
Yeah. Okay. If we can drop back in time a little bit, then. Maybe tell us a little bit about your early career in maybe undergrad, and when you decided, hey, I want to go to medical school, or
Oh, do you really want this story? This is so pathetic, this story. It's really pathetic, but it's fun. I probably decided I wanted to be a doctor when I was 2. In fact, I probably decided I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon by the time I was 3. It's really bad.
Rosemary said 5 for her, so.
It's really, this is so bad. It's just so bad. And I probably decided, somewhere I had the idea that I wanted to be a figure skater by the time I was 3 or 4, because the 2 things that I played with the most when I was 3 and 4 were this little doll that had ice skates. You have to realize I was in the South. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina.
This didn't fit very well.
And my mother would freeze those old ice cube trays for me, and so I'd make this doll skate around for hours and hours and hours on this little rink. And then my father was a physician, so that's true, but somewhere quickly I gravitated to the idea of orthopedics, possibly because there were children in my class who had polio. So the most beautiful child in our class, the little blonde, blue-eyed girl, had braces from polio, and I thought that she was just beautiful, and I thought her braces and her little white tie-top shoes were beautiful. So that year, for my main Christmas present, I requested this doll that came with crutches and casts. And my mother tried to talk me out of it. I said, no, I want that one. So I got that one for Christmas. The next year for Christmas, my main present, because I got one main present, we didn't have a lot of money. My main present was a set of crutches so that we could play orthopedic surgeon in our neighborhood.
Okay.
And my next door neighbor who played nurse to my doctor is a nurse. It's
so this
really
does
awful.
have a long history.
It's really awful. And apparently I briefly had a period of time where I thought I might be a brain surgeon, and that actually, the neurosurgery went back and forth with orthopedics for a long, long time. I had one short period of time right after reading all the Madame Curie biographies where I thought I wanted to be a physicist, but that was short-lived. The rest of the time it was between neurosurgeon, I call it brain surgeon, and orthopedic surgeon, which I didn't call bone doctor. It should have told me something from the beginning. But two most amazing things. One is that many years later, the girl that I used to skate with as a teenager said to me, "You were the only first person I ever knew who had her entire life plotted out." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You knew exactly when you were going to go where for the rest of your life." And she said, "And you're still on track." It's rather scary. The other thing, though, that really totally scared me to death, literally, in 1985, almost 1986, I received an envelope from Emory University School of Medicine, actually, from Emory University Department of Psychology. What's this about? So a couple of days later, I finally got around to opening the mail. And the cover letter said, "We thought you might want to know what you wrote 10 years ago." Open to the next page. And if it hadn't been in my own writing, I would have never believed I wrote this. Of course, granted, I didn't write so neatly anymore. This was like the first or second day of medical school.
Oh.
When I wrote still very neatly. But it said, "Where do you think you'll be? What do you think you'll be doing 10 years from now?" And they graciously sent this to us. Number 1 and 2, I only put two possibilities. They had a chance for 10. I listed 2 things. One was study DNA tumor viruses, because at that time I thought if I wanted to be mainly in a lab, because I'd applied for MD, PhD programs, that would be my laboratory direction. And of course, DNA tumor viruses are now HIV, which would have been a phenomenal career to be in.
Yeah.
But the second one was orthopedic surgery for children specializing in sports medicine. I wrote that day 1 of medical school.
Wow.
I would have never believed that I wrote that then, because I didn't even know I was thinking about it then.
So when did you start to skate? And did that have anything to do with what happened down the way?
Probably, but I don't really know, because I never dealt with a sports medicine doctor. I never knew a sports medicine doctor, even in medical school. I didn't know someone who specialized in sports medicine. Certainly pediatric sports medicine was really just being birthed by Lyle McKaylee. So I started skating when I was 9, late. I broke my arm roller skating when I was 8. We drove by this brand new ice rink. My mother said, "You're crazy. You're never going in that place. You're a Southerner and you fell and broke your arm roller skating." Next year, my next door neighbor had a birthday party at the skating rink and she couldn't say no. Right. And another little girl and I were the first to ever compete from Georgia. And I was the first person to ever become a gold medalist from Georgia. So that was just kind of fun and new, and I got to train with Olympic champions. I traveled around the country to be with a coach who unfortunately moved a lot. And it was a very cool experience. Went to 4 different high schools and competed through college. So I took 2 semesters off of college to compete.
And where did you go to college?
I was at Wellesley, so I was in Boston. So
great,
it was, Skating Club of Boston was not that far away. But then, as I said, I took off 2 fall semesters to compete. And finally did what I wanted to do at a nice level, never making nationals, but being ranked somewhere between 20th and 30th in the country, which was all I needed to do, all I wanted to do. I didn't want to have what was then a really terrible touring life of the successful skater. So that was not where things were going to go. So it's hard to figure where the sports medicine part came, except that I loved one sport. That's really it's more of an art, though, and I'm mainly an artistic skater.
You were an athlete, though. I mean,
but I thought of myself more, I think, as an artist.
I see.
I was a terrible jumper.
More like a dancer.
Well, and I had been a dancer before I was a skater, and was a serious dancer. Had a place offered to me in the junior company, but went off and skated for the summer and never came back at 14. So it turns out it was great, because these cheeks with their hair all pulled back don't look so great. At age 14, how was I to know that this was going to be my shape? But it turned out to be a great shape for skating. Would not have been a professional ballet dancer's shape. But whatever's the case, somehow I just came up with this idea that sports medicine was a thing to do. So in my 3rd year of medical school.
Which was at Emory?
At Emory. I went back home to get warm.
Okay.
From Atlanta, went home. I figured somehow the rest of my life I was going to be cold, and I wanted to be warm for a year, 4 years, and for a while. So I went home, 1st and 2nd year. The only sort of seminal thing that happened about orthopedics was about the 3rd week of medical school. We're down at Grady Hospital, and the chairs of the departments come out and give lectures to the medical students to kind of introduce you to clinical medicine, what it's all about. So one day, the orthopedic doctor came out, and of course I was all excited. And he gave the talk, and I went up to him afterwards and said, "Dr. DeAndrade, I would love to do orthopedics, I think, but I do have some concerns about the physical nature of orthopedics, and are there any problems? Should I be dissuaded from being an orthopedic surgeon just because of my gender?" He was an Indian man. He's just delightful. I still adore this man. He says, "Of course not. we have power tools. So that was the end of any doubt there. And so aside from, again, this neurosurgeon, pediatric neurosurgeon versus pediatric orthopedics, but I went back and forth, even as late as internship, even when I was already accepted into residency. I had a last moment and finally decided orthopedics was the way to go. But in third year of medical school, my second month was on orthopedics. And I must have been voicing this thing that I was interested in sports medicine. Exactly, just a regular third-year rotation. Yeah. And the guy said, well, you know, Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery has an advertisement for someone doing a pediatric sports medicine fellowship. So you should call this guy and find out what it's all about. So sure enough, Lyle McKaylee had just begun advertising for a fellowship. So I called him and said, hi, you know, I'm a third-year medical student, and I think I'd like to do children's sports medicine, and here's the things that I think I would need to know, some nutrition and some psychology and some physiology. In other words, here's the things I think for children in sports seem to me logical in addition to knowing the orthopedics. He said, absolutely, and come spend a year with us. I said, well, you know, like when? He said, well, I think when you apply for residencies, you should tell them that you want to split your residency and do a year at Harvard. And of course they said, no, we don't do that.
Because it's a 4-year program,
It's internship plus 4 years.
Yeah, okay.
And so no one would let me split between years 3 and 4, and that's nearly impossible. It sometimes happens, but it's nearly impossible. But 2 of the places said, yes, you can, we have a research year availability that we allow half, or encourage, make half of our group do. And so 3 of the 6 of the residents at the place I eventually ended up going will do their internship, do the laboratory research year on the Allen Fellowship, and then do the 4 years of residency. So I said, great. Put case first, ranked there, ecstatic. Come up to March of the end of my internship year, and the chief of the department calls me and said, so Angela, you know, whose lab do you want to work in for your Allen year? And I said, well, you may remember from when I interviewed, you know, a year and a half ago or whatever, that for my Allen Traveling Fellowship, that Skip Knutkin, past president of ACSM, had arranged for me to spend 6 months at Karolinska, and the other 6 months I was going to spend with Lyle McKaylee, who at that time had not yet been president of ACSM. He said, can you say that first sentence again? I said, well, Dr. Heipel, my Allen Traveling Fellowship year is going to be 6 months in Karolinska, 6 months in Boston. He said, I thought that's what you said. He says, unfortunately, there is no word traveling in the Allen Traveling Fellowship that you just talked about. It's the Allen Fellowship. He says, there is no travel. So he must have seen that I was just like crestfallen. And he said, however, if you can manage to live in those places on what we would pay you to live here, it's fine with me if you don't spend the time in our laboratories, but go work with them. You know, that sounds like a fine plan.
And where was Skip?
So, well, he was actually at Spalding in Boston by then, and I think I actually met him at BU.
Okay.
So we must have done this all by telephone, because I didn't meet him until I came back to Boston, and actually I take that back. He came to Stockholm during the time that I was there in the summertime. So I met him briefly in the summertime, but there were so many things going on there that I barely met him. And then when I got back to Boston, I went over to BU, which is where he was mainly working, I think, at that point, to hear Brian Whip lecture and some respiratory physiology, and to talk with Skip and obviously thank him for the wonderful 6 months he'd set up.
So between Lyle and Skip, that was your introduction to ACSM, I assume?
No,
Maybe
Lyle
not.
had introduced me to ACSM before that.
Ah, okay.
Sure, I guess this story can go for posterity. People join ACSM for many reasons. The reason I joined my last year of medical school, although I'm told I must have joined the year before, but the first meeting when I got my 25th year paperweight a year earlier than I thought I should have, it turned out I must have joined in my 3rd year of medical school.
Wow.
But right after I talked with Lyle, I guess. But at least so they tell me. I have no recollection of that. But my 4th year of medical school, the plan was that in May, I would go out to the ACSM annual meeting, which was being held in Honolulu. What a great place for a person about to start internship. So I was going to go to Honolulu, and then I was going to meet my boyfriend and another classmate in San Francisco, and we were going to run the Beta Breakers race, and then we'd all go back and start internships. So this was this grand plan. Had to borrow a little money, more money onto my student loan to do that. But this was just great. This would be the one vacation between 4 years of grind and 5 years of residency.
Wow.
So I went out to ACSM in Honolulu and loved it. Just totally loved it. And I was totally smitten. I'd never been
And what year would that
like
have been?
79. Yeah. And I just never been with a group like this. It was like being in a candy store. Mm-hmm. It was just incredible. Of course, then we only had maybe 2 or 3 concurrent sessions.
Yeah, it's nothing like now, of
No,
course.
it was just...
To be that thrilled at that early point in time.
Well, because, of course, I only had 2 things to choose between, and most of the time I was in the non-musculoskeletal stuff, because I knew I was going to be doing that. So I actually do remember a couple of conversations with famous orthopedists, at least one of which the guy was... what's the right word? I had questions about his research methods and fairness in interpreting them then. And 30 years later, my opinion didn't change. So that was exciting to see that conversation informed literally everything I knew about that man's work. He's a very famous orthopedist, presenting an awful lot of stuff, not at ACSM, I'll say, since then. But it was great to see, and I've run into him multiple times, and really doesn't change, so that was cool. But I got to meet John Bergfeld and Alan Ryan and some of the really early, fantastic people who were gracious enough to spend a lot of time with a student. The restaurant was so crowded that you ended up just having to sit with someone, so you got to meet people in that way, which was neat. I remember meeting people out by the pool, because I'll have to say, I don't think I went to my first Dill lecture. I think the pool called, if I remember correctly. It was noontime. Noontime in the pool, Dill lecture, pool.
No decision.
Not at that point. This was vacation too, remember?
Of course. Yeah.
But the nutrition and the tendinitis, as it was called then, I remember hearing my really good Achilles tendinitis lecture that kind of bridged the research side, the basic science side, and the musculoskeletal side. So it was just incredible.
So did you stay active from that point on? I mean, were you involved in a lot of the several people I've talked to talked about how the clinical case studies have come in, and more for the clinicians, and you ended up being president in the early 2000s.
Well, this was long before clinical cases.
Yeah, so what I'm asking is, were you involved in trying to get more for physicians in ACSM?
Much later.
Early on, or later, okay.
Yeah, much later.
Yeah.
Because, of course, at this point, I was just finishing medical school. I still had...
True. Yeah, all your residency
I still had
to
6
go.
more years.
Yeah.
7 more years, it turned out to be, before I was going to be in practice.
Yeah.
But Lyle was quite right. He said, if you do this time with us early on, then you'll already have papers out. Papers will have made it through the pipeline. Review papers will have been published during your residency. So by the time you come out,
Good point.
you will already be more established, and you'll already be set to be a fellow of ACSM, which, as you're probably aware, for the clinicians, especially at that time, there was no service pathway, I guess there was by the time I finally applied, but at that point, the service pathway was almost impossible.
So it was pretty much publications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you had to show publications, you had to show, of course, the service to ACSM, and for a resident, that's virtually impossible to do even now.
Yeah.
The service to ACSM part is very tough, because then the regional chapters were not as developed. They weren't as active. They were more for a few of them were clinically oriented, but most of them were more for the basic scientists. So there really wasn't a home for the clinician in a regional chapter. And frankly, when you're a resident, you don't have time. You're lucky if you have time to read the newspaper once a month.
Right.
So this worked out just perfectly. And then by the time I did finish my 2 fellowship years, my internship and my residency, so 7 years later, in 1986, I finally emerged in practice. And very quickly, I was elected to the board, because very quickly I was able to become a fellow. Very quickly, I was elected to the board. Lyle was president. I moved right on up and was mentored by these wonderful people.
When did you go to Philadelphia? I mean, was that right after?
No, no. My first practice was at the A.A. DuPont Institute in Wilmington. So that was one of these too good to be true things. I took over someone else who did part-time pediatric sports medicine, and he was moving. So they called me up in fellowship. I'd already been looking at 3 jobs, each of which I'd been offered, and was pretty well narrowed down to 2. And the chair of the department called up and said, we have this wonderful brand new facility with even a bowling alley and a disabled swimming pool with a ramp and a putt-putt golf course that's wheelchair accessible, and we'd love you to come build and direct this program. So I hung up and said, too good to be true. And my mentor was sitting right there. He said, what do you mean too good to be true? Who was that? And I told him. He said, you get back on the phone right now, we were in clinic, and call him back. I said, no, this can't be. This is like some thing from outer space. He said, no, call him back. So I did. He says, I'm dialing, because he knew. he looked in his, address book, called back. And so I said, okay, we'll talk. And so that's where I ended up going. 3 years later, I got married. We finally quit this long-distance relationship. Finally decided that I would move back to Cleveland, which is where I'd done my residency. 8 years later, then, we moved here for my husband's job. Moved to Philadelphia for my husband's job.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in Cleveland, were you associated with Bergfeld then?
No, they were right down the street.
Okay.
But it's, Cleveland Clinic and
Yeah.
University Hospitals
2
are
different things.
like this.
Yeah.
So Bergie and I only saw each other in Hong Kong, I think in Italy once. Even my almost next door neighbor, he had animals, and so I would get waked up by their roosters. So they're a mile and a half down the street. I went by his house every day on the way to work. I never saw him, and he and I both do pediatric sports medicine. But Jack Andrish was at the Cleveland Clinic, and I was at university, so we also mainly saw each other at ACSM.
Yeah, I see.
So once again, even when you live in the same town, ACSM is where you get together.
That's what I was just going to say. That's when I see Stan.
That's true.
And
Rosemary?
Rosemary.
Yeah.
Same exact thing happens to me. Well, anyhow, thank you.
We're great.
I guess
Thank you.
we're running late here.
Good deal. Hey, no, that's fine.
So
We're good.
thanks
I have
so
a meeting
much.
at 2.